So Richard Dearlove, who is the former head of MI6, thank you very much for being with us. A suspected Chinese spy infiltrating Parliament. Are you surprised by this?
Well, I'm not particularly surprised, but I think there are sort of issues of terminology, and we need to understand a little about the nature of the Chinese intelligence efforts overseas to understand probably what we're dealing with here. There are three Chinese intelligence organizations. There's the Second People's Liberation Army, Chinese military intelligence. There's the Ministry of State Security, that's the sort of civilian intelligence and security agency. But then there's a third department called the United Front Work Department, which is a department of the Chinese Communist Party. And I would speculate, and it is an informed guess, what we're dealing with here is the activities of this third department, which has an important role to play in projecting Chinese influence, in trying to divide and weaken critics of China, and basically just trying to promote a positive image of China overseas. So we use the word Chinese spy. I think probably what we're dealing with is what might be better termed something like an agent of influence. But then this needs a further explanation legally.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to say, isn't it, that the individual concerned says that they are innocent. We're choosing not to name them as well. I guess my other question is, I know you say agent is a better term potentially than spy. So, do we have spies, agents in China? Do they do the same over here? Is this all part of the game? Is this just happening anyway?
Well, I'm not prepared to speak or speculate on what we do to them. But I think that, one has to have eyes open in a relationship with a country like China. Intelligence collection and the exercise of influence in a clandestine fashion is just part of the game, or let's say the international scene as they play it. And I would say that, what the Chinese deserve is reciprocity in their relationships overseas. And I think it's clear that we should keep in mind that approach to this problem. Look, the United Front Department has something like 40,000 employees. It has an unlimited budget, and it pays people to promote Chinese communist interests. And there was a previous case in London that some of you, I think, will recall, which was, I think, a Hong Kong-based solicitor working out of London called Christine Lee, who was very active in Parliament and chucking a lot of money and gifts around. She almost certainly was working for this front department, and when she was discovered, named in Parliament, I think I'm correct in saying that she did a runner and disappeared back overseas. I've got a feeling that we're dealing with a young man who probably has been rather unwise in the way that he has behaved with Chinese contacts, and that he's got himself into the clutches of this department. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's something more serious, but that's what it sounds like, particularly if he's presenting this rather sort of strong denial.
Do you have concerns about the security aspect of this? So the vetting, how easy it might be to get a parliamentary pass?
Yes, I do. I mean, inevitably, we need to be extremely careful about, who is given responsibility and positions of access, not just members of Parliament, but their rather extensive staffs that support them.
And do you think that they might slip up here?
Look carefully. Well, it's possible that someone has slipped up. But, we've got a young man here who clearly was a sort of networker in terms of Chinese geopolitics. The Chinese probably have taken a close interest in him. And I think what you also have to remember is that there was a new National Security Act passed earlier this year, which made it an offence, which it wasn't hitherto, to have, let's say, an undeclared foreign interest that you might be representing. And I think in this particular case, for the man to be sort of accused of espionage, he's probably behaved pretty stupidly in one way or another. My guess is that there's probably a lot of money involved. And that was certainly the case with this previous woman, Christine Lee, who was handing out money quite liberally to members of Parliament.
Look, really interesting to get your thoughts. It's my job as well to point out again that the individual concern says that they are innocent. China have said that this is a publicity stunt. More broadly, I'm just interested to know what you think our relationship should be with China, because there's always the dilemma in politics, isn't there? That they want to take a tough line on countries such as China, but also they want to keep doing business with them. So what path do you think Number 10 should tread?
Well, I'm not entirely in disagreement with the path they're treading. Look, this issue is not black and white. You can be tough with China, and you can show China that you mean business when they interfere in your internal affairs, but you can also trade with them. Look, this is not a Cold War with China. We have intertwined, interdependent economies, which were not characteristic of our relations with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It's a completely different situation. And we have a very good example of how to treat China in front of us, which is Australia. Australia's had an almost identical problem with its parliament, with Chinese attempts to infiltrate people into the parliament. But at the same time, Australia has an absolutely fundamentally important trading relationship with China. And it's, I think, shown it can take a tough line. And OK, there has been damage to the commercial relationship between the two countries. But on the other hand, the Chinese have not, as it were, slaughtered the Australian economy, which they might be capable of doing if they withdrew all of their custom from the purchase of Australian raw material and Australian goods.
Do you think they would do the same to the British economy, to effectively slaughter the British economy?
Well, I don't think, I mean, they are, I think, our fourth largest trading partner. They could certainly do damage to us. But on the other hand, the Chinese are pragmatic. They're not going to overreact. I think there may be a cost if we take a tough line. I mean, look, we've already managed to take a tough line on the issue of Huawei and 5G, on which I was early on one of the most vociferous critics of the government's policy, and I'm pleased to say the government changed its policy. You can do these things, and you can do them, let's say, firmly, but maybe a good word is elegantly at the same time, and not destroy your relationship. There may be a short-term cost, but I doubt there'll be a long-term cost.
It's interesting that you say Australia is the model to follow, because it seems to me like the US is often trying to pull countries such as the UK into a tougher stance on China. Do you think that we should be standing shoulder to shoulder with the US on things like this? Yeah,
I mean, the US face exactly the same problem. I mean, they have massively intertwined economy. But at the same time, I mean, Trump, and interestingly, Biden has followed the same policy, has completely revised the way they treat China as a nation. And I think we, during a certain period, if you go back to the Cameron and Osborne initiative on China, we were pretty naive in the way that we regarded them. We were not sort of thinking about the security threat that comes from China. But there is a clear security threat. There is a continuous attempt, for example, by their the first two intelligence services I mentioned, let's say, to steal intellectual property. I mean, the Chinese economy has benefited enormously from their strategy of trying to shortcut economic development by taking other people's intellectual property. And that's a long, long track record of doing that. And we just have to, as it were, go into this relationship with our eyes open and make sure the Chinese understand absolutely clearly where our limits are. And we have only in recent times begun to take a tough stance. And of course, the whole issue of Hong Kong was perhaps a good indicator of why, we should be very careful of the way we conduct our bilateral relationship with China. I've got no criticism of cleverly going to Beijing to talk to the Chinese. You need to talk to your competitors, let's say almost enemies, and it's much better, I think, to try to talk to them than to isolate them.
Really interesting to talk and get to your perspective. Someone who is a real kind of expert in this area, certainly knows a lot about spies. So thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme this evening.